stage reading from a script. But what happens when theater and reality come one, and the fantasy that we see on the stage actually reflects the reality around us? This is what Tudor England Shakespeareans learned when they're watching Julius Caesar being performed on the Globe Theatre in 1599. The lines between reality and fantasy at the stage become completely blurred when Elizabethans watch Julius Caesar first being performed on stage. They would see that the 44 BC Rome actually reflected a lot of the political tension going around in 1599 Elizabethan England. Follow along with me as we explore the central figure of Brutus and his connection with the Earl of Essex, one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites. We'll be using the parallel text, Julius Caesar, a parallel text. And follow along with me as we go on this journey to realize that reality and theater may be one and the same. As said earlier, Julius Caesar the play was performed in the Globe Theatre in 1599 Elizabethan England. Since we are talking about Elizabethan England, it should show the significance of the one on the phone right now is Queen Elizabeth I. She's been on the throne now for over 40 years by 1599. The story of Julius Caesar itself takes place in 44 BC Rome. To understand the significance of Julius Caesar, we need to transport ourselves to 44 BC into the mind of the key politicians and conspirators in that time, just as Shakespeare did when the play was being written. Knowing the times of the performance and the history that it's based on is key to understanding how these two eras worked. Rome was governed by a republic during this time. Just as we in America have, certain noble citizens, patrons, were chosen to represent the common working citizens, which were then called plebeians. The patrons were those from noble families chosen to hold the power and to be in the Senate, the ruling body of Rome. The two highest ranking officers of the Senate were two consuls, who were selected by the republic and presided over the Senate. Caesar was one of these consuls, elected in 59 BC. Caesar was a consul for 15 years, where we see Brutus and his fellow conspirators as senators and other patrons. The republic was not without much infighting, but one common ideal was held within it, and that was that Rome would never be a single monarchy. This fear was placed by the last single ruler of Rome, King Tarquin, who was a tyrant on his people. Due to this, a great fear of plebeians, patrons, and consuls alike was that a single man and his ambitions was the greatest enemy of Rome. It is here that we see Brutus's own ambitions, fears, and motivations. Given his background as a senator and his status amongst his people and his relationship with Julius Caesar, how could we maybe fathom why Marcus Brutus murdered his best friend in cold blood? However, Shakespeare helps us out with that through Brutus's soliloquy, which we see in Act 2, Scene 1, page 70 of your parallel text. Ambition is the name of the game, and it's something we saw in Brutus's soliloquy in Act 2. These thoughts and fears that were personified inside his analogies inside of Act 2 are also found inside the fears of Elizabethan England in 1599. And we see these fears personified in Queen Elizabeth I's favorite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. We see that ambition was another power that he thought was something that Elizabeth was overthrown inside of patriarchal usurpation, because Elizabeth was toward the end of her reign, just as Caesar was transitioning into being a king or ruler of Rome. We see this inside the supplemental text, Political Issues in Julius Caesar by Robert Irving, which is from 1957. Now, if we think about these things and we see that there are parallels in just these two people coming together, and we notice that the views of 44 BC and what it could do to a leader is something that was held commonly inside Elizabethan England toward the end of Elizabeth's reign. Now, the Earl of Essex also thought that maybe he could do away with this power usurpation by going against Queen Elizabeth, but he did it a little bit more publicly than Brutus. And while their fates remain the same, we see what happens when you publicly go against your ruler, and what these fears could do to you in the end. The reality of the Earl of Essex situation is in the quality of character, not of time. In John M. Finnis's and Patrick Martin's article, Caesar's Succession and Chastisement of Rulers, it is accredited that the Earl Essex rebellion was during the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign and that the Earl Essex saw opportunity in the Queen's decay. This may have also been a decay in character as Elizabeth had stripped the Earl Essex of his titles and rank due to his perilous and contemptible behavior after his Ireland invasions and disastrous military efforts in connection to them. His rebellion also went poorly in his favor, and his head fell instead of Elizabeth's at the end. Also, keep in mind that Elizabeth was actually a monarch when the Earl Essex went against her, unlike our poor Julius Caesar, who did not reach the throne before his allies turned against him. Consequently, ambition should not be ignored, for the Earl Essex did see that Queen Elizabeth was at the end of her rule. Historically, Elizabeth died 4 years later on March 1603, almost exactly 2 years after the death of Earl Essex by beheading. The people of England knew their great monarch was to be leaving the throne heirless, for Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. Who would be next to rule? Could they match up to the magnitude of the Gloriana, a name for Queen Elizabeth literally meaning glory? What if there was a tyrant to take the throne? This is where we head back to Brutus and his motivation to end his best friend's life, as similar thoughts were in his own head. What kind of ruler would Caesar be? Would he be a tyrant? What role would he take Rome down? Was he a snake in the grass ready to strike? You might see some connection back to the soliloquy. Brutus may have wanted what was best for Rome due to these very thoughts which circulated in the society around him. As stated earlier, Rome was ruled by a republic at the time of the play. In typical Shakespearean fashion, as Julius Caesar opens up on page 20 of your parallel text, we are thrown into action from the start with a celebration. The plebeians are rejoicing. Caesar has defeated his rival, Pompey. We see 2 tribunes, Marius and Flavius, chastise the plebeians for being fickle and disloyal. Tribunes were plebeians of power, were law immune, and acted as checks and balances for the Senate. They also represent the common people of Rome. Up until that point, the tribunes state the plebeians had supported Pompey and now are cheering for Caesar because he is the leader of the republic. The descriptions of disloyal and fickle may fit our central character of Brutus, don't you think? Up until Caesar was to be crowned, Brutus has supported him, right? Just as Brutus claims to be a representation of the people, he too is historically fickle for turning on Caesar, his friend and leader. The fickleness was attributed to the struggle for power and the past rulers of Rome. Pompey was suspected to be a tyrant. According to the parallel text, it was known that at the time of Caesar's birth, Rome looked down upon the idea of absolute monarchs and any country that had one. However, come 45 BC, Caesar is the only ruler of the republic and is named dictator for life the next year. For those only a quarter under Caesar, such as those in the Senate, exemplifying Brutus and his co-conspirator Cassius, this holds more fear for them than the plebeians. They fear the ambitions of a one-man leader. Brutus is a physical representation of his people's fears and saw through Cassius' plan as a way to release himself and his people from this fear. From the line, it must be his death, and for my part. But for the general, he would be crowned. Of Act 2, Scene 1, lines 10 through 12, that Brutus feels obligated to take part in the destruction of the fear of this absolute monarch in the making. Now as we emphasize how Brutus represents the thought of his people, let's place ourselves in the seats of those watching these portrayals in the audience of the Globe Theatre in London, England, in 1599. Now that we have fleshed out the questions held in both histories, what does it say about Shakespeare and his portrayal of this Roman tragedy on an English stage? Julius Caesar the play reflected ideas already placed in Elizabethan's minds, according to Hannah Lawson and Amelia Searcher's Shakespeare's Romans, Politics and Ethics in Julius Caesar and Coriolanus, digital collections for the classroom. And that question is it right to overthrow your ruler? English society had gone through their personal experience of political turmoil in multiple forms. The War of the Roses, Henry VIII's establishment and takeover of the Church of England, Bloody Queen Mary and her persecution of Protestants, England had to find comfort in Queen Elizabeth I's reign, and they found so much comfort that she was not only known as the Virgin Queen and Gloriana, but also Good Queen Bess. However, this didn't save her any grief from many attempts of revolt and power usurpation by the hands of not only our previously discussed Earl of Essex, but also her own cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. However, that's a story for another day. Now at the end of her reign, Good Queen Bess, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, has left no heir to take the throne. One can just feel the anticipation and anxiety. Much like a pacing Brutus, we are left wondering what will this new monarch bring, whether in strife or glory to England. While sitting in wait, Shakespeare gives his contemporaries and fellow citizens Roman plays that can reflect the thoughts of what might come next for their country. The most famous of these anxiety-reflective plays being Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar may not have been a historical play in genre and was categorized as a tragedy to give it a more traditional and fictional theme, but the relevance to England at the time was clear. It brought attention to many common concerns and questions of the Elizabethans, such as the aftermath of political overpowering, motivations of conspirators, the results of individualistic leadership and charisma, the duties and loyalties of citizens, and overall, the responsibility of those in office and aristocracy. Julius Caesar was a validation of these emotions and perceptions of England in 1599. Just as the English audience would have seen watching their present being presented through a story of the past, we might look around and see just how much supposed fictions parallel to our own non-fictions. Before we began this journey, we would look at Elizabethan England and think, of course, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, greatly loved in her time as a monarch incomparable to the tragedy that is Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Before, we may have thought England a happier time, with so many years of peace under Elizabeth's reign. However, that was not the case, as we found out, and William Shakespeare shows us this truth through his rendition of the tragedy of Julius Caesar. Just as it took us on a journey to bring these two eras in one dimension, we can be left with the ideal that power is fickle, and what we initially categorized as fiction can be reality. Thank you for watching.